Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around we're going back to original gangster science fiction horror films. And to do that, I'm not going as far back as Metropolis. I'm going a little bit further into the sound era and Universal Pictures' Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, Mae Clark, Emma Van Sloan, Dwight Fry, and Marilyn Harris as Little Maria. So I thought I'd go back and take a look at not only Frankenstein, but the sequel of note, Bride of Frankenstein, with Elsa Lanchester in it as well, and just see how well they stood up and whether I can offer any insights to these two films that maybe haven't been incited by anybody else, which is not the right word. I just wanted to kind of give my observations, watching it now, having seen it a number of times and enjoyed it a number of times, well, both of them. Frankenstein was banned in Australia for a very long time. There were people who saw it before it was banned. I remember some people talking about it. It was well known because, of course, the Abbott and Costello movie came out and people knew it from that. But the original Frankenstein was a little too shocking for the gatekeepers of Australian censorship to allow to be shown in Australia. So it didn't really get a release until much, much later, well into the 1960s, which is a shame. You know, Australia may well have had a much better, earlier film genre of horror amongst all the other Australian films that came out from the mid-60s onwards, had people had more access to these horror movies at a much earlier date. But we didn't, because the past is another country. People were idiots then. So Frankenstein starts really oddly, because you get a man in a tuxedo coming out. You get a man in a tuxedo come out of some curtains on a stage.
How do you do?
And tell everybody that this is a frightening movie and that this story is a bold one about man overreaching towards God, which is, for me, kind of weird. Part of the fun of a good horror movie is allowing the impact to be the impact. And the start of the censorship regime that became the Hays Code made Universal Studios a little bit reticent on just chucking the audience into the horror. So they had this geezer in the tux doing a little bit of an announcement before the titles come up. Now, there are a few interesting things in the titles. First off, the monster is not on the initial credits. There's just a question mark, because they didn't want to tell people who the monster was until after the film. On the end credits, Boris Karloff gets his credit, but in the credits at the start, he doesn't. The other thing is, the credits announce that the original story was written by Mrs. Percy B. Shelley. So Mary Shelley didn't even get her own credit in the original movie, which was rectified in a big way in the second film, Bride of Frankenstein. But in the first one, it's Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, which annoyed me because she deserved to have her name on her work. That cheesed me off. Yes, it's a different cultural thing, and yes, it was done at the time. Still, didn't like it at all. It was directed, of course, by James Whale, and we get some wonderful James Whale stuff. There's a nice panning shot over the mourners at a funeral, which ends on a skeleton death symbol, which is sticking out of one of the graves as a part of the decoration, apparently. So the pans across the crowd, and then suddenly you're on a skeleton. And there's a repeated skeleton and skull motif in this movie, which I really liked. It's like everybody in this town where Henry Frankenstein is doing his nefarious business is decorated for Halloween all the time. And I kind of like that. You get to see so many skeletons in this movie that it's almost like a drinking competition you can have. So Henry, of course, is doing his thing and has decided that he wants to create a human being out of bit parts from other human beings. And to do that, of course, he has to do some grave robbing with his offsider, a guy called Fritz, played by Dwight Fry, because apparently you can't order these things off wish.com. So he and Fritz go around getting their spare parts and putting together this man. And of course, they launch it up into the top of the tower where they're working and let it get hit by lightning to kickstart the monster, played by Boris Karloff. Of course, you've got the wonderful Kenneth Strickfaden machinery, or the Van de Graaff generators and sparking and zapping machinery that makes this film look good. It even looks better in the second film. The second film highlights Strickfaden's machinery a lot better than the first one does. Colin Clive, of course, playing Henry Frankenstein, is right from the start a nutcase. He is not the kind of guy that you want to have anything to do with. He's obsessed, he's pale and sweaty, he's not really a nice guy. And yet his fiancée, Elizabeth Lavenza, played by May Clark in the first movie, loves him and wants to get married to him because possibly he's the son of a baron. Well, he is the son of a baron, but it's possibly her reason for wanting to marry him. Baron is an interesting character because in the first movie, this is the one point of humorous content we get in the movie. The Baron, played by Frederick Carr, is a lot of fun. He's almost a progenitor of Colonel Blimp from The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. He's a bombastic, over-the-top, opinionated, grumpy and gruff guy.
You two have it all arranged, haven't you? You think I'm an idiot, don't you? But I'm not. Anyone can see with half an eye there's something wrong. And I've two eyes. Pretty good ones at that.
And I like him. He's the best person in the movie for me, apart from the creature that Frankenstein creates, played by Boris Karloff. He's a lot of fun in that. And every time he came on the screen, including right in the last scene of the movie, I really liked the Baron. I thought, he's a nice guy. He's opinionated and nasty and privileged, but he's got a sense of humour and he's a bit of fun. And the mistake that the first movie makes, that the second one doesn't, is not putting in more sly humour. There's a wonderful evocation of unworldliness that we get from James Whale's direction. The hills and the old buildings where Frankenstein does his nefarious stuff, and the graveyards, and of course the Baron's palace, are all evoked really wonderfully. Universal put some money into this, and we get all of these scenes. You get the It's Alive bit, which is still 92 years after the movie came out, is still a meme.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And Frankenstein's monster, with that wonderful Jack Pierce makeup, is an instantly iconically recognisable creature in popular culture worldwide. And that's not something that was predictable. You couldn't say in 1931 when the movie came out, yep, this is a goer, this guy is going to be around for 100 years. And nevertheless, people are still going to be drawing and reinterpreting and recognising Frankenstein's monster as portrayed by Boris Karloff with the Jack Pierce makeup a century after the movie came out. Now, having said that, May Clark as Elizabeth is, for me, kind of ordinary. She does the bare minimum playing that role. And her character, there's some darker aspects to what happens to her character which I find very interesting and which are open to interpretation. But, of course, we get Karloff turning up as the monster, and apart from anything else, it's an incredible piece of physical acting. Yes, the makeup helps carry it, but Karloff's look and that kind of gaunt, emaciated look he has, and the way his character moves, and the way his shoulder joints don't seem to work and his arms hang loosely, and the way he's always tilted somewhat forward, as if his inner ear isn't quite working out the balance correctly. And of course the big heavy lead-lined boots that Karloff wore help with that lurching, stumbling kind of gait that he has. It's such a great piece of physical acting. I watched it again this time and I thought, damn, that's good. Nobody was doing this stuff this way before Karloff did. Apart from the makeup, he makes a reanimated corpse believable in just the physicality. I doubt if there's anybody beside Karloff who played the role, who made the character look like that, made the character look right in that way. Let me know if you think there are, because I love the physical acting of this, and his physical acting sells the whole silly concept of a reanimated corpse. And there's also Dwight Frye's character Fritz, who enjoys torturing the creature with a lit torch because he knows it's scared of fire, and that of course has a comeuppance for him. It's almost like beating a dog and beating a homeless dog. The way that Fritz and the creature interact is a sadistic person attacking a dog. And even though eventually there is a comeuppance to that, which I am fully in favour of, it was a really uncomfortable moment for me watching the movie, seeing the creature being tortured for no other reason than it can be. And then we get the kind of abandonment thing too, where Frankenstein has kind of gone a bit nuts and goes home to convalesce with his fiancée and with his father, and totally leaves his creature to its own devices in the tower where he was born. And there's no provision for food or water or anything like that. He leaves this damaged, odd creature by itself to take care of his own needs. He's like a father who abandons his kid. And that parallels very strongly in this movie, because one of the main characteristics of Frankenstein's creature in Frankenstein is its loneliness. And that's emphasized in the second film as well. But the creature is lonely and bewildered and doesn't understand the world around him, as is indicated when he breaks free. He's caught by the authorities. He breaks free, and he meets the little girl Maria by the river, who starts playing with him and giving him flowers. And he doesn't even understand the physics of the difference between a little girl and a flower, which leads to the tragedy of Maria drowning in the lake and her father finding her and carrying her through the town in the middle of a celebration for the Baron's son's wedding. Those long tracking shots that James Whale did very well, where in the middle of this celebration, which dies away when people realise what's happening, man carrying his dead daughter into the town, is one of the kind of underlying and low-key moments of pure horror in this movie, and the profound effect this has on a father and his child. That stuff is pure cinema, and it's James Whale showing us horror at a different level than the big scary monster level. And I totally love that part of the movie. And then we of course get the monster breaking in on Elizabeth on the wedding day, and her having a freak out about this monster. And there's enough wiggle room there, if you watch the movie closely, where you can wonder at the nature of the attack. It could be interpreted as just a shock thing and a scare thing. It can be looked upon as a different kind of off-screen assault, even though that may not have been the intention of the filmmakers. It may not have been. It's still a profoundly shocking possibility. And then we get the pitchforks and torches scene, where Frankenstein is grabbed by the creature and taken up to the old mill, and the pitchfork and torches of the villagers follow them up the hill. And even that part is beautiful because the landscape is slightly abstract. The tower and the slope of the ground, which doesn't look natural at all but looks very much kind of abstract, works incredibly well. And of course the creature is destroyed, and Frankenstein himself is severely injured by being chucked off the mill. There's the confrontation as the monster and Frankenstein look at each other between the spokes of the wheel inside the mill, has the cogs that run the grindstone of the mill. Them staring at each other through these spokes gives us a kind of underlining of that duality. Who is the monster and who is the victim? And I really like the way it does that as well. When the tower is set on fire by the villagers, the shrieks and the cries of the creature are fantastic. There are cries of rage. There are also cries of childlike fear that Karloff gives us in those scenes. By using those vocal choices, Karloff gives us both the monstrous rage of the creature and the childlike fear and the abandonment and the loneliness of the creature, just by different kinds of yells. The movie held up for me really well. I understand totally why it became such a phenomenon culturally over the last 92 years. There hasn't been a better Frankenstein's monster than Boris Karloff. Yes, there were previous people who did it in the silent era, but this one was, I think, the first one that treated the whole thing with a groundedness and a respect, and got someone with Jimmy Whale's skills to direct the movie and to make it something extraordinary.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
That then moves us on to 1935 and Bride of Frankenstein, which, like the first movie, has an unconventional beginning. In this case, you get Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who gets a credit this time as the writer of Frankenstein, sitting and discussing Mary's story in the Castle Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva, and talking about how dear little Mary wrote a story that scared Lord Byron. Of course, Mary Shelley is played by Elsa Lanchester, and she is charming in this part of the movie. She's kind of winsome and smart and sexy at the same time, which, if people have only seen Elsa Lanchester in her later roles, She was an unconventionally beautiful woman in her younger years. The other thing I found out interesting about this is the actor who played Lord Byron, a guy called Gavin Gordon, who plays it very theatrically and campily and rolls his R's as he speaks. He gives us that naughtiness of Lord Byron that we all know historically. Gavin Gordon was the long-term and quite loving partner of another actor you know, Edward Everett Horton. They were together for a number of years and they were quite devoted to one another. And in fact, they appeared in a movie together in the early 1960s, Frank Capra's A Pocket Full of Miracles. So it's kind of nice to make these connections between people and see what happened in Hollywood that wasn't spoken of in Hollywood. And part of that was the close relationship between Gavin Gordon and Edward Everett Horton. I kind of like finding out these things. But it starts out with that conversation, and then we get into the movie itself. It starts immediately in the aftermath of the first film. Henry Frankenstein is returned to the villa and is nursed back to health by his fiancée Elizabeth, now played by Valerie Hobson, who went on to marry John Profumo, who was part of the Profumo affair, the big sex scandal in the 1960s in England. But Henry is nursed back to health by Elizabeth, and somewhere in the meantime his father, the Baron, dies. He becomes a Baron. So while he's convalescing, Henry gets a visitor, Dr. Pretorius, Dr. Septimus Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger, who steals the movie from everybody else. His Dr. Pretorius has also been experimenting with artificial life, and he, in a very camp and kind of seductive way, convinces Henry to come and see his creations.
Do you like gin? It is my only weakness.
Which are a whole bunch of quite amusing homunculi. And there is no way that Pretorius is not coded as being gay. Yes, he's camp and yes, he's over the top, but he's always slyly seductive towards Frankenstein. There are these moments of dialogue where Pretorius flatters and cajoles Frankenstein into doing his bidding. And it's Pretorius' idea, when they find out that the creature has survived the burning mill, to make a female mate for the creature. One of the other things too is there's an interesting line of dialogue when Pretorius is talking about the homunculi he made, where he says that he went nature's way when he created them by making them from seed.
I, my dear pupil, went for my material to the source of life. I grew my creatures, like cultures, grew them as nature does, from seed.
Which sees an ambiguous term, and it leads down some interesting possibilities as to the way Pretorius created his homunculi. Think about that one when you've got a spare moment. And we get an arc of kind of wisdom for the monster as well. He scares a young shepherdess when he staggers out of the river underneath the mill, and she falls into the pond and starts drowning, and he's learned to rescue people when they start drowning. So he pulls the shepherdess out, even though she's terrified as hell of him. We get a little closure on that whole Maria situation from the first movie. And then the monster encounters an old blind hermit who's incredibly lonely like the monster is. And they form a friendship, living together in the hut for a time, which is incredibly touching. O.G. Heggie, the guy playing the hermit, and Karloff have some really nice rapport and some really nice back and forth. And we learn that the monster can speak and express himself. Even though he doesn't know a lot, he has feelings at a human level, and there are those wonderful dialogue scenes between the two, where this old blind hermit teaches him some of the things he needs to know to function, at least sometimes, in the human world. That, of course, is ended when a couple of hikers come up to the old hermit's house, one of whom is played by John Carradine, and they recognise the creature, and everything goes to hell from there. And the creature flees from the hermit's house, but having established in himself that concept of friendship. Now, some people have kind of coded those scenes with the hermit and Frankenstein's monster as being the loneliness of being a gay person who has to be closeted because of society. And I think that's a valid interpretation as well. I don't think it's the only interpretation. You can watch those scenes in the movie as being a lonely gay man finding a companion And of course, with James Whale being an out gay man in the 1930s, that interpretation is not unreasonable to make. The monster catches Pretorius opening some graves to get some body parts for the creature he's creating, and the monster then goes back to the lab where Frankenstein and Pretorius are creating the Bride of Frankenstein. It doesn't say the Bride of Frankenstein's monster, it says the Bride of Frankenstein. And that plays interestingly toward the end of the film as well. And then we've got to have the resurrection scene with the lightning and thunder and the electrical arcs and the sparks and all of that cool stuff. And in this case, we get an interesting use of kites. Kites are lofted into the stormy skies to attract the lightning bolts that are going to power the creation of the bride. And the way that the lab is shot is beautiful. It's kind of done almost like a cathedral, a vertical space where the steps are vertical going up to a loft, and the lab itself is kind of shaped like that. And I think that's deliberate. There are a number of points in these two movies where there is a Christ analogy, a creature of extraordinary power created against his will in an unnatural way, which could be a description of the biblical Christ. And there is also a scene when the monster is tied up, which has very strong crucifixion symbolism in it. Of course, the Bride of Frankenstein is resurrected, and it's Elsa Lanchester, and she does some fantastic physical acting in this as well. Her bride is kind of bird-like. She looks around like a bird or a startled cat, looking around to see what's happening and moving in a jerky manner, as if her nervous system isn't functioning in the same way that a baseline human beings does. And even though it's a short role, she really gives it everything, and that's why her character is such an iconic look and turns up on t-shirts and in all sorts of places and in cosplay in the modern world. And that wonderful wig she wears, which is symbolic of lightning bolts, and her frizzy hair and the great makeup. I don't know where the great makeup came from when you're resurrecting a corpse, but chef's kiss on that. The scar tissue, there's some good makeup work there which emphasizes the strangeness and alienness of the bride in the best way. There was going to be a remake of this, by the way, in 2020 with Scarlett Johansson, but that never panned out because of the pandemic. Not sure how good it would have been, but it shows that that iconic character still, at least to the movie studios, still has some meat on the bone in 2020. Of course, the bride rejects the monster because he's not a good-looking rooster and is more attracted to Frankenstein himself. And then the monster is the person with wisdom at the end of the film. And the monster tells Frankenstein to take Elizabeth, who's turned up at the tower where Pretorius and them have the lab, and to leave and to go away. And then the monster hits the kill switch and explodes the lab with Pretorius, the bride, and himself in it. He knows that they have a future, whereas he, the bride, and the mad bastard Pretorius don't deserve one. I disagree with him. I think the monster himself deserves a chance to have some form of future. But I think it's an honest ending to the film, and it's an honest ending to the arc the character is walking, or at least lurching, in the movie. So both of these films hold up incredibly well. The monster being a lonely creature who had no control, no agency over his own life for most of his life, until he acquired friendships, until he acquired a little bit of education, until he acquired a little bit of life experience, is a universal. Universal Studios. I know I did that accidentally. It works well, and I think it's an important arc to have any time you create that monster in a movie. And James Whale, such an underrated director who didn't get the breaks he needed later in his film career, because people in Hollywood weren't entirely comfortable with a prominent movie director being a very much out gay man. And of course, then we get Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser in Gods and Monsters looking at the later life of James Whale and giving him some respect in the late part of the 20th century. When did Gods and Monsters come out? I think it was 1999. 1998 it came out. So James Whale had to wait almost 70 years to get the respect he deserved. And Gods and Monsters, if you haven't seen it, fantastic film, you should watch that. So yeah, I thought I'd end the year with Science Fiction Saturday on a classic, on something iconic, on something that has had a profound influence not only on popular culture, but on how certain science fiction stories have been told all the way since 1931. I like rewatching them. I'm very much aware of how much they are of their time and how weird little characters turn up. And the other character I haven't mentioned is Una O'Connor playing Minnie, the servant of the Frankenstein household. And she steals every scene she's in. She's a crazy old duck. And she was also, I think, in The Invisible Man, if I remember correctly. Let me double check that. She was the woman running the tavern in The Invisible Man 2 years before Bride of Frankenstein. But yeah, she's a lot of fun in it, but totally mad character. But these movies, you should watch them if you can. I've got 2 different copies of those. I've got one in the Universal Monsters box set, and I've got this Frankenstein box set. It's got Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, The Ghost of Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Good solid box set there. It's a fairly early Blu-ray by Universal, so it's got really weird menu systems, but you should be able to pick that up fairly cheaply if you look around. And it's definitely something that should be in your collection. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. Next video I do is my live stream on New Year's Eve, and that's already scheduled. You'll see it if you subscribe on your waiting videos. It's going to be at 11 p.m. 31st of December Australian time, going through to 1 a.m. in the 1st of January 2024. Got a lot of things lined up for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. And thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel by donating on the YouTube website, or else becoming a patron at patreon.com/terrytalksmovies. And if you could do either one of those, it'd help at the moment. We're still paying off Luna's medical bills, and it's a little bit tough for us right at this stage. So until next time, when I'm doing the live stream, and Luna may even appear on the live stream if she's awake, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Dive back into the classics when you can, because you're going to have a great time, and you will bring new insights to them as you enjoy them. And I'll catch you next time.